All right, welcome everybody to the end of the year book recap. I'm Philip Delitsky. I typically do this in writing on my Substack, and I might still have some further reflections there, but I thought I would try my hand at doing this on the video format. So here we go. This year I ended up reading 55 books, which is averaging just over a book a week. There were some months where I was kind of devouring books left and right, and some months where I only managed to read 2 books at a time. It was very varied. I did not find my reading groove this year. That's the truth. In past years, I think I've always found that groove, and I didn't find it this year, which led to very sporadic reading habits throughout the year. I had probably planned on trying to hit the 60 book number this year as kind of the goal that I had set for myself back in January, and I was a bit short of that, but that's frankly very okay because I was pleased with the selection of books that I read this year. A couple more thoughts about kind of general reading habits for the year before I get into favorite books that I read. First is at the beginning of this year, if people who follow my WhatsApp status recall, I listed books that I had planned to read this year, and I read none of the books that I planned to have read this year, which frankly doesn't bother me so much because, I think you can have those reading goals, but you should never be beholden to them. And the books that I wanted to read are still here behind me in my library, and I will get to them. And I will probably end this video with books that I would like to get to in the new year, and we'll see if I actually make that happen. But I just think it's funny that, you could start planning to read something and then end up not doing it. So that's the first thing. Second thing is I purposefully this year did not read as many books about war and strategy that I typically do. I read some, and there's a category of them here, but I didn't read as much, which I think was actually really nice. It's very important for specialists like myself to not only be reading books within our specialty. It's important to have a broad mind, and I read a lot wider and broader than I think I've ever done before. So I was kind of pleased about that. And then the third point that I'll make is when I was still at the Philos Project, which I was for the vast majority of this year, only up until November did I leave, I read a lot of books kind of for work, which is to say books in the Jewish-Christian relation space, which I really, really enjoyed. It's very cool to read books that kind of apply to the work that you're doing on a daily basis. And those books really enhanced my ability to do work at Philos, and I'm very pleased that I made the time to read them and that Philos helped sponsor those books because it did really make an impact on the work that I was able to do. Going forward, kind of goals for the new year before we get to the specific books at the end that I would like to read. Finding my routine for books, for reading this year is going to be a priority. Now that I have a commute every day into Washington, trying to make sure that I'm really making my train rides productive, at least in some capacity in reading. It's probably hard to be engrossed in a novel, especially when you're tired after a long day. But to be able to read something maybe a little bit lighter or something that kind of you could still absorb while being in that train car. That's one thing. So trying to kind of finding my rhythm. Number one. Number two, I did my best to keep a commonplace journal this year, which is what I have in front of me. So I would keep great lines from books that I read and kind of mark down where they were across the pages in this notebook. I wasn't as good at doing it as I would have liked, but I was good enough that I found this to be very helpful as I was writing essays throughout the year, to be able to have a notebook with all the key lines as opposed to running back to the bookshelves, which is always enjoyable. But that was something that I really benefited from. And I guess thirdly as well, to kind of tackle some really big books that I've been hesitant to tackle. I mean that actually mostly in the nonfiction world. I'm typically not as afraid to read large fiction books. I'm very afraid sometimes to read large nonfiction books, but I have a stack of them here that hopefully we'll get to. So, without further ado, let's dive into the best books I read this year, 2025. Let's start with the best essay collections. So, I love reading essay collections. I think essays are great, both in terms of learning people's different styles of writing. They're also just great you can basically microdose essays, if you will, throughout your day. So in third place is kind of a end of the year pickup is David McCullough's History Matters. This was this was edited by his daughter and his, I think, longtime research assistant. Just fantastic essays about a master historian and what history does to us, how we're supposed to devour history. I thought it was very accessible. It was very readable. And one of the funniest parts about this book, by the way, is a few months ago, in November, frankly, when I had read this, I was reading it at my desk where I now work, and I had seen that whoever the congressman was, the senator was, who was presiding over the Senate floor, was also reading this book at the same time. So that was kind of funny. Anyway, this was a great collection of essays about both David's approach to history and what we're supposed to get out of history. It's very accessible to non-historians. So this was a fantastic read, and I'm really pleased to have read this towards the end of the year. In second place, and second place is really doing this book a little bit of an injustice because of how much it meant to me, are the essays in this collected work by Vasily Grossman called The Road. I read this in Europe this summer when I was there as part of the Public Interest Fellowship, Military History Fellowship. I mean, the essays in here are incredible, probably the best piece of Holocaust writing. The Hell of Treblinka is in here. There's also some short fiction in here, and some of the fiction here is just out of this world. But yeah, one of my goals this year is to read more Vasily Grossman. If all was planned out well, I should be doing a reading group with the Catherine Project that's going to be reading Life and Fate, hopefully at the beginning of this new year, I hope. But this was incredible. I think Grossman deserves way more attention than he gets, certainly from me. So this was incredible. And frankly, just to be able to pick up this copy and to read his essays about the Shoah. So there's one called The War and the Shoah. Then there's The Hell of Treblinka. And then in terms of his short stories, I mean, all of them here were incredible. But the one in particular that I keep coming back to, I'm just going to try to find the exact title of it, is called The Old Man. And that's a story that I think back to very regularly. Anyway, that's Vasily Grossman's The Road. Number one, the best essay collection I read this year. I read it at the beginning of the year. I've written about it. I've spoken to people about it. I think about this book all the time. Is Anti-Education by Nietzsche. This is slightly cheating in terms of essay collection because it was a series of lectures that a very young Nietzsche delivered in Germany, where he rails against the currents of the German education system. It is incredible. You would think that this could have been published today and would still hit the cultural moment that we're in, both with politics and with media and with education. It was truly, this was a staggering piece of work. And the one line that I keep coming back to and that I've repeatedly come back to over the year is that Nietzsche says that the worst part about being a professor in Germany is that you could spend your day trying to mold students, trying to get them to think about questions and to think critically and analytically. And what do they do when they leave your classroom? They go home and they read the newspaper, and everything that you've done has now gone to waste. And if he's writing this in 1869, if he's saying this in 1869, just with newspapers, imagine what it's like now with social media. And that line in particular, but the entirety of these lectures really forced me to change my approach to social media. That's why I got rid of it earlier this year, because I just was thinking about that constantly. If he was complaining about what the newspapers were doing, how the newspapers were kind of getting you to believe that what they determined was important is in fact important, and then minimizing your own intellectual skills and your own analytical abilities, and all the more so for us today. So, number one essay collection, Anti-Education by Nietzsche. Moving along, let's do best war and strategy books. I mentioned I didn't read as many as I typically do, but I read some. In third place is a book that I really do love, and I ought to revisit it, is Military History for the Modern Strategist by the great Michael O. Hanlon. This book basically covers America's major wars since 1861 and distills the important lessons that those of us who craft strategy ought to know from these wars. This is just a great, if you will, textbook on how to do good strategy and how to do a good applied history. Applied history, I think, is probably the most understudied discipline for us strategists, and Michael O'Hanlon took a great stab, I think, of how we're supposed to do applied history, applied it to modern strategy. This was a great book. I'm definitely going to be revisiting this in the new year. It's also going to be coupled with Frank Gavin came out with a new book about how we do applied history when it comes to statecraft and diplomacy. So I know that I'll probably be reading those two, this and that book, Frank Gavin's book, together. So third place, Military History for the Modern Strategist. In second place, I'm slightly cheating. I'm slightly cheating because I'm picking two books. One I had read for the first time this year, and the other one I reread every year. But that would be State of Doom by Barry Scott Zellin. This is the intellectual biography of my hero, Bernard Brodie. Bernard Brodie, who's that man right there, arguably the man who won the Cold War for the United States, developed all of the basic doctrine of nuclear deterrence, his magnum opus, Strategy in the Missile Age, Escalation and the Nuclear Option. He was just, I think he was the smartest man of all the Cold Warriors, the Wizards of Armageddon, if you will, to quote Fred Kaplan. He was the best. And this book I finally got to this year is just an incredible look at the development of Bernard Brodie. One of the most shocking things about this book is that the author found old college papers that Bernard Brodie wrote when he was a college student. And it's just incredible to see how well he wrote at such a young age. I mean, no professional writes as well as a young Bernard Brodie did when he was in college. This was incredible, and I coupled it, and this is why I'm cheating with two second place options. I coupled with his collection of essays, War and Politics. This is, I think, the Bible for all strategists. I think Brodie had the clearest grasp on what strategy ought to be, and I reread the essays here every single year. And so I read these two things together, and it was a marvelous time, and I will die on the hill that Bernard Brodie was the greatest strategist in American history. Number one, the best book I read about strategy and military affairs was Michael Howard's The Lessons of History. Sir Michael Howard was, one of the giants of military history and strategy. He wrote many books, most importantly, helped translate Clausewitz into English with Peter Parrott. It's the translation that all of us still use today. He basically established the modern discipline of military history. And this book is worthwhile just for its opening essay, but of course, the rest is incredible as well. I regularly attempt to think, how would Michael Howard approach a problem in strategy? And I try to reread his books as often as I possibly can, because I gain a lot of inspiration. And it's what I took away from this book as well was just what Michael Howard expected of his students. A lot of these were lectures that he delivered, and he expected a lot out of his students. And it's a shame to me that people don't expect as much anymore out of their students like Sir Michael did. But this is incredible. I would urge everybody to read any bit of Sir Michael Howard. His memoir, Captain Professor, is fantastic. Of course, The Causes of War, probably his best essay collection. This was superb. Number one, Sir Michael Howard's Lessons of History. Next, Let's actually do a brief segue before we continue with books with best films I watched this year. I I watched a lot more movies this year than I'd ever done before, and I only have DVD copies of some of them, but none of the ones that made it onto this list, which I will rectify. Number three, the third best movie I read this year, I watched this year, sorry, was Le Cercle Rouge, The Red Circle, which was one of Alain Delon's movies. Alain Delon is becoming my favorite man who ever lived. He died, I think, last year. An icon of just the French film industry, but also just an icon for men and style and fashion. He was just the GOAT, and I've become obsessed with him. So Le Cercle Rouge is this fantastic 1970 French noir film. It is so well done. The cinematography is incredible. It's also very cool to me to watch old movies when the world didn't have digital technology. And I'm going to talk more about that in an essay that I'm writing, so subscribe to my Substack. But that movie was just incredible. The movie revolves around a heist, and the heist scene itself, I think, is one of the greatest cinematography bits that's ever been made in a film. So number three, Le Cercle Rouge. Number two, and I thank my buddy Matthew for putting me onto this movie, is Metropolitan, a Whit Stillman film made in 1990. It's funny. It's cool. There's so much there to learn. There's a lot of depth there. I ought to rewatch it. Metropolitan, if you want to see kind of what the kind of cool upper class intellectuals looked like in New York in the 20th century, probably some people that I would have hung out with, definitely watch Metropolitan. And I thank Matthew for bringing me onto that movie. Number one, this is not a surprise considering how much I've been on a Alain Delon kick. Number one, Plain Soleil, or Purple Noon, which is the French adaptation of Patricia Highsmith's The Talented Mr. Ripley. This was Alain Delon's debut film. It is perfect in every regard, and we'll leave it there. You should just watch it. Movie was made in 1960. I don't think I could ever probably get old of that film. So that was a brief interlude with films. Next, let's do best books I read with Jewish-Christian relations. This was fun. Of course, when I was at the Philos Project, this was kind of my bread and butter, and I really enjoyed reading some new books, especially that came out, that are related to Jewish-Christian relations. At number three is a little memoir called Strangers and Neighbors by Maria Poggi Johnson. I'd heard about this from my old professor, Rabbi Soloveitchik, when he was on Bishop Barron's podcast. And this is a book about I believe, Catholic professor in Pennsylvania who is the only Christian who lives in a very Orthodox neighborhood, and how she learned to live there and what she's learned from her neighbors. And I read this in one sitting. It was awesome. And it was just Jewish-Christian relations at its finest. And I think those of us who have worked in this space, will continue to work in this space, this ought to be the manual of how you do Jewish-Christian relations. I really loved this book. So, number three, Strangers and Neighbors. Number two was a new book that came out in the past year or so, a few years ago, 2022. Catholic Spectacle in Rome's Jews by Emily Michelson. This book was terrifying to read, but also so brilliantly written that I honestly couldn't put it down. Basically documents the 200 years or so of Catholics attempting to forcibly convert Jews in Rome, and they would do this by conversionary sermons that they would force the Jews of Rome to sit in on. This was just an incredible book. The history is fascinating as it is frightening at times, but she really does the history justice. I think she doesn't ever fall into polemic here, which is hard to do when you're talking about so charged a topic. But this was an awesome book that I spoke about to friends, Jews and Christians alike. So this is an awesome book, Catholic Spectacle in Rome's Jews. But number one is a book that came out this year. I actually attended the American launch of this book, and that's Jesper Svartvik's Jewish Foundations of the New Testament, Addressing the Roots of Anti-Semitism. This is an incredible achievement. Jesper Svartvik, who's a pastor, I don't remember, from Sweden, basically looks at the most controversial verses of the New Testament that relate to anti-Semitism and attempts to explain, perhaps an alternative understanding as to what they could mean. It's a very brave book. I would encourage everyone, if you're not going to read it, to watch the launch of it with Boston University. He was there. I managed to throw in a question about the book there. But this was just very brave and very convincing, at least to a non-Christian like myself, that you could probably find a better way to explain away some of the, inconsistencies, if you will, in the New Testament, kind of Paul's thoughts about the Jewish people. And you could find an easier, less anti-Semitic explanation for some of those verses. So this was very, very brave. I can imagine a lot of people are not going to like what's written in here, but I think it's, from my layman's perspective, one of those books that you ought to contend with. And this was a pleasure to read. So Jewish Foundations of the New Testament by Jesper Svartvik goes to number 1. Best poetry collection. This is obviously hard because poetry is so personal, and I read so many random poems throughout the year. But in terms of collections, number 3, and it's like really frustrating to say number 3 because some of my favorite poems are in this collection, but work with me here. Number 3, Some Desperate Glory. The First World War, the poets knew. I've come to terms with the fact that my favorite poets were the First World War poets. And I want to read more of their poetry. I want to read more of their biographies. That's one of the books that I'll show you that I plan to read in the new year. But Wilfred Owen, Siegfried Sassoon, Evan Thomas, their poetry was incredible. And I think there was recently, by the way, an article in Fox News about the masculinity crisis in poetry these days, how many people don't think that poetry is a masculine thing, despite the fact that pretty much throughout all of human history, the best poets are men. And this is certainly true of the World War I poets. This book gives some context to the poetry. I ended up buying so many of the dedicated collections of each poets, but I attribute my love and fascination with the First World War poets to come from this collection. So this was incredible, and I will revisit these poems and their poets repeatedly. So, Some Desperate Glory. Number 2, the poet that is my favorite. The First World War poets grouped together are my favorites, but my favorite poet is, of course, Rainer Maria Rilke. This is a new translation of the Book of Hours, which was subtitled Love Poems to God, came out at the end of last year, but I finally got to it this year. I don't know what else there is to say about Rilke other than he probably saved a good chunk of my religious life. You'll have to take my word for it. I'm sure it's better in the original German, but this new translation is incredible, and Love Poems to God is really the best way to describe what Rilke did in this collection of poetry. A large part of me was saved by this collection. And if that's not a good endorsement, I don't know what else is. So the Book of Hours by Rilke. The number 1 collection is number 1 for what it does, in addition to the poems that it has. But it's Edward Hirsch's collection of 100 poems to break your heart. These are not poems that Hirsch wrote. Hirsch was a great critic of poetry and literature. He has a book, which I have somewhere in front of me, called How to Read Any Poem and Fall in Love with It, I think. And what he does in this collection is he selects these heartbreaking poems and then walks you through what the poem is doing. So if you're like me and you're only learning now how to get into poetry, how to read poetry, and dare I say how to write it, this book is a great instructional to learn how a poem works, how it does the thing it sets out to do, in addition to just showing me some incredibly beautiful and heartbreaking poems. But I took this out from the library, read it for a few hours, and then ordered it online because I just knew I had to have it. So that's 100 Poems to Break Your Heart by Edward Hirsch. Fiction. I didn't read as much fiction as I wanted to this year. That's the truth. But I'm pleased of the novels that I read. We'll give one honorable mention before we continue with the top three, and that's Goethe's The Sufferings of Young Werther. If you spend some time online, which I recommend you minimize, you'll be familiar with I guess it's called the sensitive young male meme, which I admittedly relate to. And young Werther is kind of the archetype for the sensitive young male. So I read this. It's my first Goethe. It's incredible, as noted by how many lines I loved in here. It's definitely not a make you feel good book at all if you know the ending of this. Just the title should tell you that you're about to read the sufferings of a young man. But this was a work of art, and I appreciated getting to meet young Werther. That's the honorable mention. At number 3, I read this with 2 friends, and I'm very glad I did. Graham Greene's The End of the Affair. First, I'll tell you this. You should also watch the movie. The movie was incredible. But, I mean, there's so many good lines in here. You could tell that Graham Greene was dealing with his Catholicism while also writing this. Somehow managed to win my sympathy over a man having an affair. And just brilliant, punchy writing that makes you feel, that's evocative in a fairly short book. And I would like to read more Graham Greene in the new year. But this was incredible. And also, go watch the movie. So number 3, The End of the Affair by Graham Greene. At number 2, probably something that you're not surprised to see. I noticed that a lot of people have read this book this year. I have my suspicions as to why. But that's A Month in the Country by J.L. Carr. I've written about this on my Substack. I read this in one sitting. It's very small, but it was one of the most amazing experiences of reading in my life. I felt restored by the time I got to the end. It's brilliantly done. It moves at this pace that draws you in but never feels too rushed. And the metaphor of restoring this painting while you're restoring yourself was perfectly executed. And this was, by the way, another one where the movie is incredible as well. Yeah, this is definitely going to be reread in the new year. But number 2, J.L. Carr's A Month in the Country. At number 1, for the best fiction I read this year, is a book that, for me, was a major accomplishment to have finished. I tried on many occasions to read this book and failed every single time because it is a very hard book to read. But I read the book earlier this year with the Catherine Project in a reading group, and that was the only way that I was able to finally read it. And it's become probably top 3 favorite books of fiction I've ever read in my life. So at number 1, James Joyce's A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. First of all, that this wasn't made into a movie yet, I think is a bit of a scandal. But I really related to Stephen Dedalus throughout the novel, and I think that it was so brilliantly done to follow a character from infancy into adulthood and how that changes the writing style throughout. I mean, Joyce was a brilliant modernist writer, but then also the tension between art and religion and independence was something that I very much related to on a very personal level. It was also, by the way, a great novel to read when you're engaged in Jewish-Christian relations, because you can't really understand A Portrait of the Artist as a young man without also understanding Christianity and Catholicism. And I had many great discussions. The scene in this book that I regularly talk about to my Catholic friends, where Stephen goes to confessions, is to me one of the most heartbreaking scenes I've ever read, but is also a very important scene to understand both the nature of Catholicism, what Catholicism was like when Joyce was writing this. I mean, I regularly go back to many of the lines here because it was just so damn good. And of course, I got the Norton Critical Edition, which meant that the essays, the supplementary essays in the back, really helped me kind of make the novel come alive. And I just think that if you can find the means to read this, because it is very hard, and you can find a group of people to read it with, this is one of the most rewarding, incredible, beautiful, dare I say, sublime pieces of writing ever. So number one for fiction this year, James Joyce's A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. But the number one book I read this year, without fail, and I'm already rereading it, is a book by a man who I've slowly come to love. I ought to read more of his fiction, but the story of him is incredible, and this was just a book that I think about all the time as well. And I keep this book actually by my desk because of by my bed, because of how often I come back to its lines. And that's Stefan Zweig's The World of Yesterday. I think people know that I'm very critical of modernity and of the modern ills in society. And I know that my old history teacher in high school had a favorite book called The Past Was a Great Place. It Still Sucked or something like that. And something like that. But there was something, I think, better about The World of Yesterday. And Zweig, I think, really captured that for me in this book, talking about pre-war Vienna and what the literary scene was like and how people lived their lives, and how even, and I had reflected on this in my video when Charlie Kirk was assassinated, how even when an anti-Semitic party comes into power, the Jews are pretty much still okay there because that's just how society worked. This was really, really beautiful. I want to read just one passage in the foreword. The foreword, by the way, was very, very scary because you could just tell Zweig was so aimless in the years during World War II before he tragically took his own life. But he writes here talking about his family. And it's just important to read because of the contrast to our lives these days. Both my father and my grandfather lived their lives in a single direct way. It was one and the same life from beginning to end, without many vicissitudes, without upheaval and danger, a life of small tensions, imperceptible transitions, always lived in the same easy, comfortable rhythm as the wave of time carried them from the cradle to the grave. They spent all their days in the same country, the same city, usually even in the same house. As for what went on in the outside world, fundamentally that was only something they read in the newspaper. It did not come knocking at their doors. This was the best book I read this year. I'm going to be rereading it repeatedly throughout the next year. And if there's one book that I can say you should just go pick up and get, it's Stefan Zweig's The World of Yesterday. That's the reading recap. Let me know what you think about those books. I'm going to share a couple books that I would like to get to in the new year, knowing full well that when I did this at the beginning of this year, I kept to none of them. For nonfiction, continuing my love of the World War I poets, Soldiers Don't Go Mad. This is basically it's a dual biography, I think, of Owen and Sassoon, both when they were in hospital and how they started writing poetry. I'm hoping to get to this. Williamson Murray, who was one of the greats in military strategy. This is the last book he wrote before he died, The Dark Path. I love Murray. I have most of his books, and I have to get to this. A book I said I would read this year and didn't, which is a shame, but Jeffrey Warrow's new history of the Vietnam War. I am woefully ignorant of the Vietnam War, so I'd like to finally get to this. And then a book that I had a hard time finding, but finally found, and that's Matthew Sturgis's biography of Oscar Wilde. I really want to get to this. In terms of fiction, I have a whole stack here of things that I'd like to get to. Walker Percy's The Moviegoer, great Southern Gothic novel. I love Southern Gothic, and I really want to get to this. And my buddy Clifford Lee Sargent at Books Are Better Than Food also loves this book, so I want to get to it. I want to read some more Vasily Grossman, including Everything Flows. I think this was his final book. Love to get to this. A book that I've been neglecting for a very long time, I don't know why I'm so terrified of it, is L.P. Hartley's The Go-Between, with one of the most famous opening sentences in all of literature. The past is a foreign country. They do things differently over there. Hard Rain Falling by Don Carpenter, apparently considered an American Dostoevskian novel. Always struck me as being interesting, so I'd love to get to that. I should finally try my hand at Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse. So many people who I respect said that this was the best book they read this year, and I want to try it out. And look at that cover. Beautiful. And then finally, I need to just get over my fear of Jane Austen and read one of her books, either Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice, or Emma. Hopefully I stick to some of these. Anyway, that's been the recap this year. Happy reading. Let me know down in the comments what you read this year. And I look forward to seeing you sometime in the new year. Happy reading, and have a great new year.